I just would like to express some concern with the comments Taras made about, some of the people he mentioned I don't really know. But one in particular I was a little concerned about, and that was Dominique Carrel, and in an interview, I think it was in February, he said that he's not written anything for 3 years. What has he been doing? Has he been on holiday, etc., etc. To be fair, I think Dominique's contribution is a little different in that he puts together, first of all, the largest conference of its kind, the Association for Study of Nationalities Annual Convention in New York, which attracts graduate students, junior scholars, and senior scholars as well from all over the world. I would say really there's no other similar event of it like this anywhere. And it includes maybe 10 to 12 panels on Ukraine on a regular basis, and they are probably outnumbering the number of panels at the American Slavic Association and many other institutions. University of Ottawa also runs the Daniliu seminar, which is one of the best attended seminars I've ever been to. And also, things like introducing new graduate students to each other and getting responses, from, say, a graduate student will present a paper and then a more senior figure will respond. And I think this is a very good way to create dialogue between younger and older scholars. So in all these respects, I think his contribution is enormous. And it may well explain why he doesn't write op-ed pieces. I mean, I don't think everybody writes op-ed pieces. I've known Taras for years and we get along fine, so we're not enemies. It's just that particular thing I thought was a bit out of line when you consider what Dominique has done for Ukrainian studies over the years. And I think if someone is spending a lot of time doing the conference aspect of scholarship, as opposed to simply writing, well, not simply, but writing articles and books, etc. It's hard to compare. I mean, I've only put together a couple of conferences, but they took an inordinate amount of time, along with teaching and graduate supervision, etc., etc. So it's a really hard task. And to put something on the scale of SAN on, you would not have time to do very much else at all. I mean, it's sort of 6 months of planning. So that's all. I was also concerned with the polarization of debate on the question, let's say, you can call it generally EuroMaidan studies or, Ukraine conflict studies. I don't think has to be polarized in this respect that you are either supporting Ukraine or you are a Russophile. Because I think most academics don't fall under either rubric. If they're examining this question dispassionately, they're obviously looking at different sides and different reasons why things might take place. So I guess what I'm calling for is a more reasonable form of debate. Of course, the best form of debate is at academic conferences, which are better, I think, than swinging punches at each other over YouTube or social networks, which seems to me what happens most on this question of EuroMaidan. And I think it's getting, well, it's not finished by any means, but it's getting a little bit further away now, so that it's possible to get more information. A colleague of ours, William Risch, who was in Kiev at the time of EuroMaidan and also in Donbass during this same period and, interviewed many people, has waited and waited to bring his book out for this very reason, that in fact, over time, you can get a more rational picture, a more well-rounded picture, I should say, of what is happening and why, rather than sort of make an instant analysis based on certain information, but perhaps not all information, because on this topic it's impossible to get all sides. I think Taras is correct to say that some people are narrow in the choice of sources, right? They don't necessarily read Ukrainian sources, or maybe they don't read Russian sources. So their picture is necessarily based on what they read, and perhaps, their innate feelings about the events that have taken place. Because what you have here is a complex situation by any standards, but there are different sides. And you've got, for example, the separatist regime. Well, actually, Alex Melnick pointed out to me yesterday in a talk here that to call it separatist is probably not the correct way, because what are they separating from? They're not necessarily out to join Russia, and they're not necessarily wanting to leave Ukraine either. They simply want more power within their own little kingdoms, which happens to be in eastern Ukraine. So the different sides in this conflict are changing all the time. And I don't think that's always reflected in the debate either. I've also felt for a long time that there's too much emphasis on Vladimir Putin as the arch enemy of Ukraine. And that is the reason why, is that Putin himself is part of the Russian fabric, but he's only one part, and he's actually somewhere in the middle of it. There are forces in Russia far more extreme than Putin, and there are others that are much more moderate than Putin. And I think the question of Ukraine's eastern territories is a good explanation of the complexity, because Putin himself has tried to pull out on several occasions, but always been forced to back up these regimes, Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. So too much focus on the Russian leader, I think, is self-defeating in many ways, because there are other aspects of this conflict other than Putin's plans. It's often seemed to me that one feature of Putin's policies is that they're very instantaneous. They're almost like gut reactions, short-term, nothing really planned. And I think his situation today in Syria is a good illustration of that. What are the Russians really hoping for in places like Syria? I mean, does he want to establish a base? Does he just want to keep Assad in power? Or is he really looking to boost his situation back home by having a sort of successful aggression abroad that is necessarily quick and decisive and successful? And I think that actually might explain Putin a little bit better than having some kind of grand scheme to conquer half of Europe or establish a Russian world and things of that nature. Yes, I think on the one hand you can say that the annexation of Crimea, occupation of Crimea was an illegal act. I don't think that's even in question. I don't necessarily think that every single thing has to be an object of discussion. What I was suggesting is that maybe the need is to discuss why Russia felt prompted to do this. It's not as if Ukraine and Russia hadn't survived as independent states for something like 25 years and signed a treaty of friendship in 1997. Of course, this is pre-Putin, but nevertheless, the two states could coexist more or less successfully for a quarter of a century, and then everything changes. Now, why did everything change? And some commentators would say, well, look, NATO has moved since 1997 right to the border, with the addition of Poland and the Baltic states, which also means that NATO forces are on Russia's border as well for the first time. This is seen as a threat. And some argue, such as Stephen Cohen, that Russia has been retreating constantly since 1991, but perceives Ukraine to be a red line, so that when Ukraine decides to move away from Russia and integrate with Europe, then something has to be done. So this isn't a question of whether the invasion is right or wrong. It's obviously wrong, but it's a question of why the forces in Russia did it and what their objectives are. I mean, is it a limited thing? Is it simply limited to Crimea, or have they got something larger in mind? And if they've got something larger in mind, which forces in Russian society are pushing this and which forces are more conservative and resistant. So this is what I mean. I'm suggesting that you don't focus only on legality, but also the bigger questions behind. And also there's a difference between it depends on who's speaking. If you've got state actors, say you've got a prime minister, you've got a foreign minister or something like that, their answers should be quite different from a professor sitting in a university somewhere who's been studying it for 20 years or so and can offer a more longer-term perspective on events. I mean, if you look at it another way, I mean, I'll make an analogy, right? A complete fabricated analogy, but an analogy. The relationship between Canada and the United States. We have, 36 million people. You probably have the United States probably has 300 million people, right? So, well, more or less 10 times more. And Ukraine actually is not as outnumbered as Canadians are to Americans. But in terms of the size of the country, you can make an analogy. And also the power as well, the sort of economic and military power. Let's say military power of a country. Canada is not in the same league as the United States, right? The United States is the main one. Canada's in at least sort of these middle type country. And you could say the same about Ukraine and Russia. In fact, even less so for Ukraine because its military at the time needed reforming. So what I'm suggesting is, Canada decides it will turn communist. Canada is going to be a communist country, and instead of trading with the United States, it's going to trade with Russia over the northern border. Now, under no circumstances would that be acceptable to the United States. And the question is, how would they respond? But there's no question that they would respond. So perhaps from someone like Putin, who is a ruthless KGB man, who is quite happy to use violence as a means of diplomacy, how is he going to react to a situation where his pal in Kiev has been kicked out of office, has run to Russia, situation seems out of control, Russia is losing any influence it had over Ukraine. No matter how much its influence it's had over different times, it's going to be gone. So if you look at it that way, then it seems to me that some kind of limited action from Putin's perspective might be justifiable. But where should it be? Well, you choose the one part of Ukraine that has an ethnic Russian majority and a city like Sevastopol, which is clearly pro-Russian and has been for a long, long time. And that's where you go. And then you sort of, make a referendum or something to make it look legal or semi-legal or whatever. But how much further was Russia really intended to go? Well, maybe, first of all, you see how Ukraine reacts. And it's the fact that all those major cities in central and eastern Ukraine, west of the Donbass, but still eastern, all of them rejected this idea out of hand, the idea of becoming part of this Russian world concept, one after another. And it was evident to Putin, because he's not stupid, that Ukraine was never going to collapse in the east. There was never going to be a large group of states that were interested in breaking away from Kiev. Even in Donbass, Ukrainians don't want to do that. They don't want to separate from Ukraine. So this, to me, means that Putin's goals have to be changed. They have to be more limited. And the limitation is you make a mess. You make a mess, and the one thing you've got to see is that government doesn't join NATO, and second, it doesn't join European Union. Having done that, there's not much else to do. Maybe go to Syria and make the mess there. But these little conflicts that have been, let's say Russia's been a major catalyst of many of them, Georgia, Transnistria, etc., none of them have been resolved ever, right? Transnistria today is still as complex as it was back in 1992. I just had a student finish a PhD on this topic, and that was more or less his conclusion, that Russia's not acted as a benevolent force, but it's not been able to resolve anything in this area. Georgia, same situation in 2008. Nobody recognizes these breakaway republics. And as for the two breakaway republics in eastern Ukraine, even Russia doesn't recognize them. So this is how futile it is. And instead, it seems to me, this is nothing better than an educated guess, that Russia has gone and got rid of all the troublemakers in eastern Ukraine, and the people who are there now are nobodies. The people are not going to cause Russia any problems. They might start a little military attack somewhere, but they're not lunatics. There's no more Igor Gherkins in eastern Ukraine, or Gibbies and Motorola's and people like that. They're all dead. Oh, sorry, excuse me, Gherkin's not dead, but he's out of the scene, but the others are dead. So, that seems to me to illustrate, first of all, that Putin's original goals failed, and second, that he's no great ogre. This is a man who didn't get what he wanted and wants to look good in the eyes of his own people above everything else, but also in the eyes of the world. So don't treat him like some new Hitler or someone who wants to control the world, because that's not, that's not feasible. And Russia is a middle power. Russia's economically not even a match for Canada. It's somewhere analogous to Italy, perhaps, in terms of its economic clout. Could you imagine Italy controlling the world? So I think it is possible to exaggerate the effects of Russia. Yes, Russia broke the law by invading Ukraine. It's caused nothing but trouble with its violence in Ukraine. But I'm also saying that the attempt to do more than subdue a few regions in the east and annex Crimea, apart from that, the whole mission has been a failure. That's what I'm saying. And that is not really saying anything about Putin other than that he's not as great as he thinks he is, or the image that he tries to put over as some kind of global player, because that's what Putin would like to be. But he isn't. He isn't. And if you look at the Russian economy, there are more important things to do. You've got to deal with corruption in the Russian society, but also in the higher levels of the Russian government. And this is why so many people were protesting in Russia last month when they watched this documentary about Medvedev and the sort of lifestyle that he's been leading secretly, right? Because this is not above board. He's making up names for himself and ordering things. And if he's doing it, then you can be absolutely sure that Putin's doing it as well. So this corruption at the higher levels of Russian society is really what brings opposition. The small things like, you occupy Crimea or you occupy some region of Georgia, then back home, that is represented as a success story. I don't know why it's not unique to Russia, but every time a country is in trouble, if they're powerful enough to make a small military gain somewhere, it reverses the situation. My point in this whole exercise about Putin is to say, keep him in perspective, because, okay, he's the enemy of Ukraine. There's no question that that's how he is regarded. But he is not as powerful as he may seem. You know what I mean? You can see a way out of this eventually. Putin will not be around forever. He makes mistakes. He doesn't have a long-term policy. And Russia is suffering as a result of his leadership. Sooner or later, even with all the propaganda organs, Russians will pick up on this. I mean, they've already picked up on the propaganda. So I don't think on that respect there's any great difference between me and Taras other than the perception of Putin. But I understand why Ukrainians feel that way about Putin. Obviously, he's the foreign guy who comes over and takes your land. That's the way you're going to look at him.